Now, I've got two things here, well, three really. One is going back to what Norman said on the 2010, that is the 30th anniversary of Glacier View, about the consensus statement, to check that I was right. And we're all getting older, so we forget bits. And I'm also looking at this article, Norman Young, a reluctant participant, looks back at Glacier View. I also went and found out where it was. I thought it was on Spectrum. It was in Adventist Today, Volume 14, Issue 6, in 2006. And this is page 8 and 9, and then it goes back to 7. I'll see how I feel about reading that afterwards, but Norman wrote this because of some regrets he had about Glacier View, and what jumps out particularly on page 7, which is the end of the article. So it starts on 8, goes to 9 and goes back to 7, as I said. 25 years after the Glacier View meeting, I wish to record that the sentence in item 2 of the 10-point statement commencing with the first person plural is not mine. It is a responsibility of the screening committee. I was only the author of item 2. I had no meaningful input into the other 9 contributions. Finally, I wish to say I deeply regret my final sentence. And on the end he put, it can be very difficult to find. I might start again. This is an unwarranted reduction of Adventist belief. And he says that he convinced Des that it should have gone in if the fairly positive statement was to survive the review process. So that's why Norman feels bad about his participation, the main reason. And I can't speak for Norman, but that's what he particularly mentions that he wished he hadn't done. And anyway, now back to the 2010 video. Howard Fisher, who actually wrote the 10-point statement. Was it the Sanctuary Review Committee or some other body? Norman, I think it was Neil Wilson's idea to do this. He said that he'd been approached by some administrators who were actually a bit lost. They needed some guidelines where the strict differences were. And to my knowledge, Neil Wilson appointed the people. He certainly approached me. 30 years ago, it was back a bit, but I think it was on the Tuesday morning, certainly at breakfast time, that I remember, that it was breakfast, and I went to Jim Cox and said, what did he think about going on such a panel? And he said, it's a hard call, and left it at that. That didn't help me much. I went to Des, and he said, better you than somebody else. My gut told me that somebody else was better, but I took that guidance. My daughter was only in her teens at the time. I paid her less attention than I do today. Today, as a very qualified and insightful social worker, I often go to her for advice, and her advice often is, Dad, follow your heart. I wouldn't have gone on that panel if she'd been older and given me that advice, because my heart was telling my head, in fact, my head and heart coincided in telling me not to go on it. So assuming that Neil Wilson appointed the others, they were in my memory J.R. Spangler, Jim Londers and myself. We met only twice. We produced our document prior to the consensus statement. We met about midnight the first time and divided up what we were going to do. So different people wrote different parts of the 10, and I wanted to put on record that I only did one of them, and I'll have to face the music on that one. It was never voted in the plenary session. It was never read out in the plenary session. And then he thinks, and he says, well, it was maybe read out, but it wasn't voted on. Now remember that the process was deliberately planned, because in the morning, the whole group, including Des and me, I've said this ad nauseum, they handed out the consensus statements, they read them through from the front, there were comments, and they voted on them. And I've told you that the vote was not recorded because Milton could never find it. Or I shouldn't say it wasn't recorded, but it seems as though somebody took away the evidence that it was voted on. There was no other input into its production than those names, and I think I may have got them all that I just recited. They were the only ones, and he's got that correct. So we were asked to leave, and the question is, why did they ask us to leave? Why couldn't we have listened to what was said? Part of a plan. Of course, I might be paranoid, but see how it all worked out. Howard Fisher, so was it used as a reference point in the Glacier View proceedings, or was it Norm? No, simultaneously, Howard Fisher, just a kind of preliminary Norm. It just went to administrators to say, here's where it's at. Here's Howard Fisher, this is where we have some problems. Norm, this is where Des is out of sync with orthodoxy. And so Arthur then says a good account, Norm, but it wasn't a good account. I'm not saying it was deliberate, because it's not exactly what he says in his article, which was written 4 years before. See, Neil Wilson told the people who wrote that 10-point article that it was to help administrators to fine-tune what the real issues were, but this is Neil Wilson, the Prince of Doublespeak, speaking. And you'll remember that when I talked about 1983, there was a backstory, the real story of what was happening in 1983. They wanted to get rid of Des's credentials. They wanted to call him apostate. They wanted to punish Des further. But the front story from Neil Wilson comes as a grand gesture. We want to see if we can bring you back into the church. I've talked with all the division presidents. They're all against it but me. And I've said, no, we must do it. So you cannot trust the Prince of Doublespeak. And Norman, it seems, believed the purpose of this document was to show administrators this is a short form version of where Des differs. But to me, it was part of the overall plan, and I'll talk about this afterwards. Again, Arthur Rye, and as I watch Arnold, not Arthur, Arthur Patrick was at the line before, Arnold Rye, who has since died, but a wily bird, and he has said elsewhere that he was on the executive committee when, a week after Glacier View, I think, when Neil Wilson sent a tape and basically told everybody how to vote. As he said, a very strong person, Neil Wilson, and an amazing politician. And anyway, Arnold Ray, I gained the impression that this document had the potential to open up the discussion on the sanctuary question, but this hasn't happened. Is there a reason why it hasn't? Now, Arnold, I believe, is referring to the consensus statements where Norm has been talking about the 10-point statements, because Arnold's comment makes more sense when he says that. I gained the impression that this document had the potential to open up the discussion on the sanctuary question, but this hasn't happened. That doesn't make sense applied to the 10-point statement. Arthur Patrick, if a teaching is under threat, it's dangerous to talk about it. Norman, back to the 10-point statement, it was just never discussed. It had a limited purpose to inform administration. Once it did that, it was only going to be a short-term thing. And this is where Des and I would differ with Norman. It was used to fire Des. The notes of Spangler prove this, because because they show how it was read out in the afternoon, and the consensus statements were not referred to, only Des referred to it. And the 10-point statement, Des says, was used to fire the many ministers who were defrocked. And then it's inaudible. Norman, in draft form, yes. Remember, the 10-point statement then went to a steering committee which met on the Thursday night, but I wouldn't swear to that. That steering committee was not only a number of personnel who were listed under the steering committee in the ministry magazine, but it also included the people who were leaders and the secretaries of the small groups. So it was a fairly large group of people going through it with a fine-tooth comb. I sat in on one session, no vote or anything. I couldn't speak, I was there as an observer. They certainly went through anything that came through, including the consensus statements. Now I'm going to make a few comments on this. I think I've made my point. And I need to say here, none of this Norman being involved in the 10-point statement has ever bothered me, because he treated the brethren as having honest motives. He'd still think their motives were honest. I'm not sure. I think they had a plan, and they planned it. They said what they were going to do. They did it. Then in the ministry they said what they'd done. And the documentation is very clear. So they could go through and just ignore the idea that there was any change in the consensus statement. They could talk about them as beautiful documents that agreed, and in their mind they agreed with what they'd always taught. And this, of course, is a flight of fancy. So on one side you'd have the scholars who might say, okay, Des wrote a 900-page paper. We were all given time to go through it, paid off time for 2 weeks before, so I understand. We had all these meetings through the week, 3 hours a day, answering specific questions. We appointed leaders. The votes of each person in the group were taken. Now, Cottrell, in that spectrum issue that I told you about, said that reports were taken where things went for Des and against Des, and that they actually reversed it when they printed out the review. So there is skullduggery going on. So they might say, and I'm just making this up, towards Des, 14. No, well, there's only 7 of them. No, well, I don't know how many there were in each group, but say there were 20 in each group. Towards Des, 14, against Des, 6, and in some cases they reversed it. And it makes me wonder, there was a questionnaire read out at the beginning of Friday morning, which I haven't talked about much, and they'd read it out at the beginning of the week on various things to see which way the wind went. And the report was that this questionnaire went more towards the church and against Des, but I'm wondering whether they didn't reverse the two. After hearing what Cottrell says about how they reversed the votes in the little groups. Just a thought. And I'm still talking about the scholars. Think of the plenary meetings, 4 of them, to hear the leaders report to the full session of all that they'd done in the morning, and then all the activity, the all-night writing of the consensus statements by Bill Johnson, Fritz Guy, Duncan Eva, and possibly Richard Lesher. And the scholars had been told at Loma Linda by Neil Wilson, who was down there the week before Glaze Review, no doubt, knowing they would tell all the other scholars, Des is not on trial. In the first meeting, he said the same thing, but he added that his ideas were on trial. You can say what you like here. You have immunity here at Glacier View. So if you were a scholar, you might imagine that what you were doing at Glacier View and Des's manuscript and the consensus statements had some contribution to the decision. Surely that was only fair. But here's another view from the administrative side. Parmenter insisted Des be dealt with before he came, and he wasn't talking about exonerating him. Various church leaders, and I've given that elsewhere, stated that he would be fired. Somebody, can't think of his name now, told Heppenstall at SoCal camp meeting that Des was going to be fired. The GC spent a lot of time preparing the Dallas Statement of 27 Fundamentals. They rushed it through because they wanted a statement against which to judge Des. It was given to the Andrews men probably in late 1979, but it was worked and reworked, and the brethren at Washington, D.C. at Glacier View had the last word. And if you listen to the tape of Larry Geraghty, or you find that paper online or in the file of papers that I've set aside, you will see how the Dallas Statement was put together and how it was changed at the last minute. And Neil Wilson, remember, stood up at the beginning, and I say this in the early letters from Glacier View, which is pretty fresh, and probably will find it in Spectrum. He used the Dallas Statement as a benchmark at the beginning of the meeting. He said, we're not going to change this week. It's going to go all one way towards the church. So he stated at the beginning, this is how it was going to be. Then Neil Wilson on Tuesday initiates the production of the 10-point statement. He states that it's to be done to help administrators who are lost with all the complexity to understand the main area of differences that I've mentioned. This is Neil Wilson, the Prince of Doublespeak. Note his, I've said that before. So it's done in a fair hurry by the six. They don't spend a lot of time together. And I've told you about Norman's article, A Reluctant Participant. Very important to read that, because that will give you the history of the 10-point statement, how it was produced. And then we see from what Neil Wilson says in the Dallas Statement, in Larry Geraghty's history of the Dallas Statement, and when Neil Wilson stands up there, he tells you that he doesn't see any difference between the traditional view and the Dallas Statement of 27 Fundamentals. It's only semantics, i.e. they are the same. That was a key point for me in understanding how Des was judged. Because I was sort of thinking he was judged by the traditional view, but the ministry said he was judged by the Dallas Statement, and the answer is that Neil Wilson stated that they were the same. And again, that's a flight of fancy, because clearly they were different. So Des agrees with the consensus statement, just moved in his direction. Good? Right? No, totally ignored. Friday afternoon he's asked to read the 10. Does he agree? Yes, he said it's a fair statement of the differences between his and the traditional view. And this is what is used to fire him doctrinally. And his assertion that he can live with the consensus statement, that it's moved towards his opinion in 7 to 10 places, is not believed by the brethren there. And as I mentioned, very godly men, very good men. And I make a difference between them and Neil Wilson, because Neil Wilson knew some of the scholars had already told him of the differences, but he wasn't listening. He had a purpose. So there's two groups, the scholars who think they've been heard, and the consensus statement is the benchmark, and they're assured that Des is not on trial. And then the administrators, especially Neil Wilson and Parmenter, who design the outcome using the 10-point statement as the basis of discipline. And helpful happenings for the administration because of Heppenstall. They believe scholars don't agree with Des, and Norm's statement on his 10-point, I think it's point number 2 on the book of Hebrews. This is an unwarranted reduction of Adventist belief. Wouldn't have helped Des. People like Hans Larendel, who said one thing to us and another thing to the scholars, and he could say it because some things He agreed with Des, and some things he didn't know, and he could say he didn't agree with him. And the silent ones, like Alwyn Salem. Now, Alwyn Salem did speak out, as Lyndon Rogers informed me yesterday. He was informing, Lyndon was visiting us yesterday, and he said the 2005 meetings on Glacier View, the 25th anniversary, Alwyn does speak. And so these will go online as well down the line because Phil is so busy. So you should look for the 2005. And Des's daughter talked to Bill Johnson, talked to Barry Oliver some years ago because she very much wanted the church to set things right with her father and admit they treated him wrong. And Des and I weren't part of that. We're not interested in restitution. Des is quite happy with what happened at Glacier View, very much at peace. He believes that he was born to go to Glacier View. And we have no desire to go back into church membership. Every so often we talk about it, but we also, because of the continuing problems in the church and the way Ted Wilson behaves at the moment, probably even worse than his father, more conservative, less smart. Anyway, but what happened at that time, when Alen talked to Barry Oliver, USA said this has to be resolved in Australia because the action came from Parliament, and Australia said they were unable to do anything because of USA. Anyway, I got off my story, even though I typed it, how the scholars were caught off guard. And the virtuous and the intelligent would not be able to believe the administration would do what they did, all with a great veneer, in some cases, genuine Christianity, and in other cases, a veneer of the synthetic type. But it's clear that some people, some very good people, did not see the progress of the consensus statement, but Wilson did. People like Jim Cox and Fred Veltman told them. And I've told you, he said to Fred Veltman, don't go public. So it was not on Neil Wilson's part, I came, I saw, I conquered. It was I planned, I executed, I won. The master of sleight of hand, Neil Wilson, planned to fire Des by the Dallas Statement of Faith. He said clearly that he would do it at the beginning meeting. He had 6 people write up the 10-point statement, showing how Des differed from the Dallas Statement of the traditional view. He used it in the Friday afternoon meeting. He denied the consensus statement made any advances, and he said he did all this in the Ministry magazine. I don't think it was clear in the minds of everybody, but in those who wrote the Andrews letter, it was clear. It was clear in Cottrell's mind. I'm not sure it's absolutely clear in Dr. Young's mind. Now, I have rambled, I admit it, but you won't believe that this was mainly in my head. A friend, after I did the first 5 videos, wrote and said, you must have spent hundreds of hours doing these tapes. No. I sat down and wrote a script, and I didn't change it. And much else of what I did was reading documents and letters. My video on Heppenstall was pretty much verbatim from memory. And I added videos as something came into my mind. I keep saying I finish and then I think of something else, which I go and research. But pretty much I had this all in my mind. Glacier View was 37 years ago, and long forgotten, even to those who've been very keen on pulling it apart. But you've got to remember, it changed our lives drastically. Des was highly regarded. I'm not talking about the right-wingers and all the stuff that was going on, which was all the time. But it was distant, it was out there. But we went from being highly regarded. Afterwards, they stopped publishing all his books. He wasn't allowed to preach. He has preached occasionally in Adventist churches, but if Neil Wilson knew about it, he stopped it. We've been made to feel like lepers when we attended church, or I wouldn't say we've been made to feel like lepers, that's not a good expression. But Des told Arlene Cherry, a close friend, he didn't tell me, that every time he went to Avondale, when we came back to Australia, he felt like a leper. Never told me that. But most people have been very friendly. But we're always aware, if we go to church, that there are many people who think we shouldn't be there. And of course, in 1983, he was further punished and he was called apostate. Now, those men knew the difference between dissident and apostate. And apostate means you've left Christ. Never true of Des. My point is, to be vilified and shunned is not a pleasant experience, and we've had a lot of it. Most of it's been distant, it doesn't cross our path. We don't worry about it. But I think of Glacier View every day. That's why I could sit down and chat about it for over 20 videos. And yet, in a sense, it changed nothing. God's goodness to us over the years is palpable. The friendship of the saints, the love and helpfulness, the appreciation, they make up for it. And of course, a knowledge of the gospel of Christ. Thank you.